Hello and welcome to plus-sized kite reviews, the long-awaited big air kite comparison video at least 3 to 4 people have been asking for, where I, a 105 kg rider, try a variety of big air kites and tell you what I think of them for boosting and looping. I am going to primarily be focusing on how does it boost, woost, how does it loop, does it give you the confidence to progress in those areas? But I will also try to talk about the overall feel, some things like hang time, safe minimum loop heights for a 9-meter version of that kite, and to some extent what I think the kite would be better for if it's not specifically big air. Because I'm no way affiliated with any particular brand and I buy my own gear, I'm only going to be reviewing my own kites, my friends' kites, or kites a local shop can lend me out of the kindness of their hearts. I've tried to film every kite in at least 25 to 30 knots, with enough flat water to get a similar feel on the boosts and the loops, and woo scores of course. If you happen to be from a kite brand and want me to update this comparison to include something I missed of yours, please feel free to send me a kite, as I am very open to bribery. A quick info on me: I'm 41, I started kiting around 2013, so I am very much your average enthusiastic shit muncher, as a mate of mine likes to say on his podcast. The first kites I bought were a 2014 10-meter North Evo and 13-meter Dice. I eventually got into freestyle after a couple of seasons for a little bit and rode boots for a few seasons, but injuries to my shoulder and knees halted that progression, so I started to get into kite loops around 2018-2019. I found in your late 30s, if you've had a lot of bad injuries like I have from kiting and other sports, the progression is pretty slow going, so one of the key factors I will be mentioning in this review will be confidence building. Because if you want to progress, especially with big air, I think it's a huge factor if your kite makes you feel confident enough to try new things that are kind of on the edge of your ability level. The kites I've tested are the Core XR7, the 2022 and 2023 North Orbit, the 2022 Naish Pivot, the Ozone Edge V11, the Ocean Rodeo Rise V1, the Reedin Supermodel V3, and the Eleveight XS V3. I will be riding all of these on their own bars ideally, with 22-meter lines wherever possible. So first up, I will be starting with the North Orbit because they're some of the kites I happen to own and have the most footage of. I think they're a great baseline for big air because they're so well known. They boost and loop very well, but not necessarily the best in any particular area, depending on your riding style. I'm certainly a bit more familiar with these kites than the others, but I've tried not to be biased. I started riding the Orbits from the 2020 model, coming from a 2019 duotone Evo. I'd already started to do pretty big loops on the Evo, and on my 10-meter Dice before this, but I was in no way close to meg loops. Which I consider to be loops over, say, 13-14 meters with a lowish kite angle and at least 35 knots. At the time I was only doing loops on occasion when I plucked up the courage, but over the first few months of owning an Orbit that really changed, and the progression in it for loops was very noticeable, to where I was throwing them almost every session and in stronger winds as well. Each year the Orbit's gotten a little better. The jump from 20 to 21 was the biggest for sure. The kites got way more stable, and North eliminated a lot of the little issues in the first model. The 21 to 22 wasn't a huge jump, just minor tweaks and weight loss. But now the 22 to 23 is a huge step up again. I've been flying the 10-meter 23 a few sessions, and it really feels more like a 9.5 meter if you're looking at the 22s. I was doing looping tricks I never usually try on a 10-meter the first session on it. It's quite smooth and forgiving and comes around really fast. The Orbit is definitely not the best boosting kite. Other more bow-shaped shoot 12 type monsters like the XR or the Edge will definitely get more riders higher woo scores, but it still does boost really well, and I would not sit too far behind those kites, perhaps 5 to 10%. Where the Orbit has a massive benefit over most other big air kites is that it perhaps has the most direct feel, a fairly soft bar pressure, and it's a confidence boosting style when you get used to it. It loops amazingly, and more importantly, it recovers and catches as good as any of the kites I've tried, making it very forgiving when you're progressing in big air loops. It's the only kite I really feel confident doing kite loop rotations on, and big switch-sided loops on because of this. And it would certainly be the first few kites I recommend to anyone getting into kite loops. The responsiveness translates really well to also working on tricks on your switch side, be it loops or boost. It's great not only for loops, but big scent jumps, as the kite's pretty hard to stall no matter where you send it. It always wants to sort of catch you and be a bit forgiving. This translates really well to heli loops as well. You can do them pretty tight, of course, above your head, or pull slower, bigger ones quite easily. One of the downsides, though, with the orbit that loops so well is that it can be quite hard for an amateur like myself to get the kite quite low. Slower kites just do that automatically, which gives you a way harder, more extreme yank. So if you're not looking to progress and you're just happy doing big angry loops when you ride, then this might not be the ideal kite for you, as you will lose some height and you will lose some aggressiveness in the kite loops. But you can, of course, get them lower if you really focus and work on pulling it a little slower and steadier. All in all, the Orbit's downsides are really just nitpicking, because it certainly is one of the most fun big air kites you can ride. On a final note, it is for me one of the most comfortable bars as well, also probably the most comfortable. It's annoyingly doesn't have an auto unwind after you loop and rotate the bar, things like that, which is kind of annoying for such a loop-friendly kite, but the feel of it is really good in the hand. So I actually would recommend a lot of riders using other kites to just use this bar, because it's super easy and really comfy. Up next, our second kite is the Core XR7. I own an 8 and 9 meter of these, and I also have flown the 10 meter version, and I actually bought a 7 meter XR6 for my wife to learn on. Everybody knows this is the insane boosting machine that is the world title on Woo, and the most top 20 sessions, I think, over the last few years, and it certainly lives up to that as soon as you put it up. The bar pressure is heavy, the general movement of the kite is a bit slower than most of the other kites I reviewed, but when you send it and really commit a little bit of aggression to it, this thing shoots to 12 like nothing else, and it just wants to stay up there as you climb. This is very useful at grabbing all the little extra gusts you didn't know were there, and I would say jumps on average about 5 to 15% higher than most of the other kites I tried in the equivalent size. When I haven't ridden an XR for a while and it's really windy, it takes me a good 15 to 20 minutes just to feel confident again on it, and probably even longer to throw some big loops. When it comes to looping, it's one of the slower ones, as you'd expect from all that power, but it yanks like crazy, which is super fun, but you do have to keep the kite quite active after the loop just to make sure you keep line tension for a clean catch. You'll notice a lot of the pros tend to send it slightly off to the side as it recovers. You can also see why the pros only tend to compete with it with 7 or 8 meter versions, because the 9 and 10 are just not forgiving enough and too risky, I'd say. The hang time, as you'd expect with those characteristics, is among the best, but it can be a bit trickier to time your heli loops when you're going big if you're not familiar with it, because the kite just wants to stay at 12 most of the time, so you need to stay pretty active, moving around a little more. If you do try it, definitely make sure you give it at least an hour or so to get adapted to that feel, and perhaps don't go out on it in your first session if you're going to be really strong. Consider even riding a size down from most other kites on this list. I love this kite for just throwing big woo scores and doing big straightforward angry loops, but I find it a bit too intimidating for progression with things like riding switch, loop rotations, and things like that at my size, because I need a 9 or larger usually. My preferred size for the XR7, as you can see in this clip right here, is definitely the 8 meter. It's by far the most fun, and you really want over 35 knots to feel what it's all about. The Sensor 3 bar is actually really well designed and works wonderfully, although I find the grip a bit lousy, and some of the parts start to deteriorate after about 6 months. Now, kite number 3 is the Ozone Edge V11. I found this kite very similar to the XR7, so most of that review applies here. The shape, the power, the movement, and the overall feel are very close. I found the bar pressure was a little bit more forgiving on the Ozone, and the kite felt a little bit more playful for general riding, but it was still one of the 2 slowest kites tested. I've only gotten to ride this on the 9 meter, but I'm very confident the 8 meter would be my size of choice because of how similar it was to the XR. Although it moves slowly in general, once you put some muscle into it, just like the XR, it really shot up to 12. So big, powerful loops are heaps of fun on this kite. One thing I didn't really like was the bar and its 23 meter lines. The feel of the grip itself was a bit like a re-gripped tennis racket, which might be to some people's likings, and the slightly longer lines I didn't really enjoy. Although it doesn't seem like much, even just a 5 to 10% change in any area with a big air kite becomes a lot when it's 30 knots or more, and I found those slight delays in the lines were hard to get used to and feel comfortable with. Where you could argue this is helpful might be in learning loops, because you could pull a little later in the jump and keep the kite at a higher angle, so there just isn't quite as much commitment. I would, however, personally recommend, if you get an edge, maybe get a north bar. They're super comfortable in the hand, have the 22 meter lines, and they also have the same low V. I know a local rider here who rides edges, and he doesn't even own north gear, but he bought a north bar and he seems to really like it. This kite would actually be a great combo if you have other kites in sizes 9 and up and you just got the Edge 8 meter, so you could really use it for woosting in those really nuking days. On to kite number 4, the 2022 Naish Pivot. Another kite I rode in the 9 meter size, but unfortunately not in the windiest conditions, only topping out around 28 knots. The kite was a friend of mine's who would also try a variety of other kites with me, so I was able to get a lot of feedback from him too. I feel this kite kind of fits more into the free ride and progression category, where it is a jack of all trades, but perhaps master of none in the big air section. It's a bit similar to the Duotone Evo, which is a kite I owned in a 9 meter until I switched to the Orbits in 2019. I think the Pivot is amazing if you want to do a little bit of everything, and probably is better suited to a lighter rider too. The bar pressure was light, the kite was very playful and maneuverable, but it certainly felt the least powerful of any of the kites I tried. I actually swapped over to my 8 meter XR right away, coming from the 9 meter Pivot, and I immediately felt more powered, and my woo scores backed it up, jumping about 10 to 15% higher. Although the Pivot's defense, I am more familiar with the XR, of course. The loops were fast, but you still need to keep the kite moving a little bit after the loop to make sure you get up for a quick, clean catch. I feel like the 3 struts did compromise its stability when the bigger gusts would come through, so it would probably be an issue when it was super windy. And where this probably would be an advantage is it's probably quite a bit flightier, and the lightness would probably give you a big advantage if you're a pro doing like double loops and stuff like that over an Edge or an XR. I would recommend this kite to beginners and intermediate riders, or people looking to do multiple disciplines where you want to foil and surf as well. I think it'd be better than most of the other kites for that. If you want to ride specifically just big air though, and you're a bit heavier like me, the other kites are probably better options. Kite number 5, the Reedin Supermodel V3. This kite really felt just like the Pivot, although I did ride it in a size 10. I was lucky enough to get a session where the wind started around 20 to 25 knots and got over 30 knots towards the end. I think overall it's a little bit more free ride and progression focused than the Pivot, but the feel is so similar, it's very hard to say specifically where it would be better or worse. I think I like this one a little bit better for looping, but the Pivot a bit better for boosting. This is definitely, as advertised, one of the best all-around kites you can get. So although it would not be my choice specifically for big air, it might be one of the top few if I wanted one kite to be able to have a great big air session, then just hop on some strapless, get into foils, and just do everything with one kite. The loop was nice and quick, but you did have to work a little bit for that catch on the 10 meter, so it could give you a bit of false confidence there, thinking it was faster and easier to loop than it was, but that probably wouldn't be much of an issue on an 8 or 9 meter, so I'd recommend sticking to those sizes if you want to get into loops or progress with your loops. I thought the bar was brilliantly designed, although I found the thin grip a little bit annoying, but I guess you'd probably get used to that, or if you were a smaller rider, you'd probably enjoy it. Kite number 6, the Ocean Rodeo Rise V1. Certainly one of the kites I was dying to try the most because of the hype and the price tag, which was about 40 to 50% higher than any of the other kites. So shout out to NZ Boardstore for letting me borrow one. I was riding the 10 meter, of course, and at first when you launch it and just start riding upwind, you think to yourself, okay, so this feels like a 10. With its shape, it kind of reminded me of a pulse or a dice, both kites I've rode a lot of in the 10 meter size, but I couldn't really see what all the fuss was, but even though I do love this shape of a kite. There was 10 meter power and it felt pretty stable, even though I was riding it for the first time in 30 plus knots, but it wasn't until I cranked that bar up on my first loops that I realized what the deal was here. This kite motors around the window and shoots back up quicker than anything else I think I tested. Now, annoyingly, I had my GoPro in wide as opposed to super wide, which I usually record in, so I've missed quite a few loops from this session because the Rise loops so high and tight, but I've included some footage from a vertical perspective I was also filming, and from another friend's perspective to see the height and the angle of the kite. It took me a bunch of loops as well to really get the kite down a little bit. Even as low as 30 degrees was quite a struggle, despite jumping 14 meters when I was pulling some of the loops. The wind kept creeping up this session and it got up to 35 knots in some gusts, and the kite held beautifully. So I got that pulse feel that I love, but with more stability. I actually set a 10 meter kite woo PB for myself by just over a meter on my first session on this kite, so it certainly has some juice to it. That's not to say I think it can compete with the XR, the Edge, or perhaps even the Orbit for height, because it is a bit less user-friendly and does require a bit more timing to get the send optimum. But if you've come from C or hybrid kites, it'll be right up your alley. This could actually be the best kite to learn to do kite loops on for a heavier rider, because the 10 really zips around like a 9 and gives you a lot of confidence to try them without as much physical risk. I never tried any other sizes, but I would imagine I'd also love the 11 and 12 meter of this kite, because the only other kites I've ever looped in those sizes are the Orbit. I don't, however, think I would enjoy this kite as much in the smaller sizes, because it's probably a bit too zippy for me. In summary, if you don't mind selling your car, getting a second mortgage, or risking divorce papers from the wife, and are looking for a super fun 10 meter, this kite is definitely a winner. I didn't try the standard bar they have, only the fancier click bar they make, which I didn't feel I really enjoyed because it was quite fat in the hand. So when it really got windy, I just used my north bar, as you can see in the video. The final kite of my testing series was certainly a wonderful surprise. Like several other major brands, we don't have a retail outlet for them here in Auckland, but luckily a friend of mine ordered one in from overseas. The conditions were only about 25 to 30 knots, and unlike the other kites I tried in 9 or 10 meters, we only had an 8, but I did swap my 8 meter XR after this to validate sort of my feelings about it in those conditions. Right away I could feel how nimble the kite was, and it reminded me of an old Dice 8 meter I used to have, with a little bit of that rise kind of feel as well. It certainly had more stability from the added struts though than say a Dice or a Pulse, and you could notice that in the gusts, and there's definitely a good amount of power as well. I really loved this kite actually. It was something I would have preferred in a 9 or maybe even a 10 meter size. It did overfly it a little bit in jumping and looping, but that's also from it being an 8 meter that I don't often get to ride. In the past I have used an 8 meter Orbit though, and I find there is a bit more stability with those. The kite has elements of the Orbit I like, similar power, great loop, forgiving catch, probably with a bit more bar pressure though, and not quite as stable. So I think if you like the Rise, if you're coming from a C kite, it would be quite a good one to move to for big air. It's definitely an underrated kite. I quite like the feel of the bar as well for this one. Although the quality of it didn't seem to be quite as good as some of the others, and that's just based on feel and look, of course. There you have it, 7 kites, all excellent options depending on your style of riding, your goals, what you like to do. I should add, if money was not an object, my ideal quiver would probably be the following. In the 7 meter, I don't own a 7, but I'd probably go for a supermodel or a pivot so that I could also do some surf and foil with it and share it with my wife, who's a lot lighter than me, and she's just progressing with kiting. In the 8 meter size, again, as a heavier rider, I'm only taking out an 8 when it's 40 knots or more, so I'd probably go for an XR7 or possibly an Edge just to really do some big old loops and do some woosting. In the 9 meter, my favorite size, I'd have to say my favorite overall kite of all that I tested was the Orbit. It's just great for a bit of everything. In the 10 meter, it was going to be the Rise when I first tried it, but since I've tried the 2023 Orbit, I can't decide between the two of those, so because money's a factor, I'd have to go with the 23 Orbit. 11 meter, again, if money's not an object, probably the Rise, but I didn't test it. The Orbit is amazing in the 11 meter. If you're going 12 and up, really whatever you like. And thank you for watching. Please hit like and subscribe, because if this channel grows, I'll probably get around to doing more cool kite projects. You can follow me on Instagram at Jason of Montreal, and feel free to fire me a message if you have any comments or thoughts of other projects I should do. Thanks.